Something I've heard for the entirety of One Piece's lifetime is that the game is incredibly unbalanced. Now, it tends to mean something different depending on who you ask, but honestly, I do generally agree, especially looking at this game's history of card design. There's a complete lack of future-proofing, card designs that are obviously overvalued, and a large percentage of matchups that are just non-games. But there's a lot more to it than just the standard complaints. Really, a game being unbalanced does not inherently mean a bad game. More so, the enjoyment of card games is built on the unbalances from the randomness in a hand and the randomness of an opposing matchup. The maneuvering and outthinking that those random situations necessitate is what card games fundamentally are. Unbalancing drives dynamic gameplay. For example, the reason I love Carrot as a deck is because of how the field spell Zoe limits an opponent's options to a controllable few and speeds ahead my tempo in an unbalanced manner. It forces an opponent to change their standard playstyle and lets me flex my position in a way an opponent can't. Unbalancing can be good, but it's more of a question of how it's implemented. If matchups are too one-sided, designs too uneven, or if the designs interact in ways that remove too many outcomes, the randomness is diminished and a player's ability to impact the game feels removed, which is where unbalancing tips into being unfun and oftentimes bad. I want to look at how One Piece is unbalanced, and look at different aspects of its game design and talk about where the enjoyment comes from, as well as where the game is more poorly handled. I'll be looking at how the leader system warps game design, how One Piece's card economy works, and how Bandai is trying to future-proof the card game. If we look at things from a deck win percentage, One Piece is very well balanced. Multiple decks from each color manage to see top semi-consistently, and even though one color might end up pushed for a while, they all go back and forth. But if we zoom in from a macro level, we can see our first issue with matchups. There's a rather large number of decks that can expect to almost automatically win or lose based on the matchup. Now, let me clarify. There's a difference between an advantage for one deck and a complete cancellation of an opponent's options. For example, in the set 11 format, Bello Betty was favored in the blue-purple Luffy. It's not a guaranteed win, but it's a lead inherently to the Bello Betty player based on how these decks run. But if we look at a matchup like Bello Betty into Buggy or Carrot, it gets very bad, really taking an absurd amount of luck for the game to even be competitive. These matchups feel so uncounterable that they can entirely discourage playing a deck for no other reason than to avoid these matchups. At a local level, if you had a few Buggy players, it can ruin your enjoyment of your deck. And on a more competitive level, you have to prepare to roll the dice or lock in to an absurd degree. Let me clarify a few things about this data before we move on. This is general total player pool win rates. It tends to reduce away from the extremes, as it does include players who aren't overly competitive with their decks. Of course, it can shift dramatically both ways once players know how to use their decks. But it is still a good baseline to have the following discussion, especially for explaining why matchups feel so abysmal in One Piece. In One Piece, even on less problematic decks, you expect to have multiple meta 70-30 and even 80-20 matchups. Even if you can play better to increase your win rate against these decks, it is a very legitimate balancing concern on a level above other games. So, why is this? Well, I think it's entirely on the leader system. While I do praise the system for being casual friendly and very interesting to deck build around, it does come with some big design problems. The leader system creates static imbalances to the game state. A leader like Zoro will inherently amplify the power level of aggro cards, compared to Enel, which will encourage stall and removal type cards. So the inherent imbalances you'd see from deck to deck become dramatically more impactful, and deck archetypes also get reinforced. This is especially true for leaders, which are restrictive to how an opponent's deck works, like with Carrot, Yamato, or Mihawk. These matchups and balances also come from the color system, where the play styles and different card pools offered are going to be fundamentally unbalanced from deck to deck, obviously. And it's why the closest to One Piece's matchup win rates is Magic. Games like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, where decks can share a high proportion of the same tools, are going to be more balanced by default, especially when considering how many staple cards are shared between decks. In games like One Piece, where decks have distinct static modifiers outside of cards in hand, will be more unbalanced. But what's actually more fun? Those static modifiers do allow for more player expression while deck building, but they can also end up closing off entire directions of play and creating non-game states if handled badly. It really comes down to individual cards and formats. If the developers can get it right, then the imbalances can make a game work. Some One Piece formats really reflect this, and some really don't. And it means we'll have to look at other aspects of balance. Card economy is the value of cards played each turn. If you'd play a Pot of Greed in Yu-Gi-Oh!, you'd draw 2 cards, which is a +1 for hand economy. But if you just lost a card, you'd go -1. You can divide card economy into a few smaller sections: hand economy, board economy, mana or resource economy, and life economy. Faster games will tend to value hand economy the most, but moderate games will put more emphasis on board and resource value. One Piece is interesting because how it's designed ties together these individual resources. One Piece has its card economy primarily focused on hand advantage. If it gets low enough, you die. Board is a direct influence on hand economy, and resource economy is how you influence board economy, more so with Dawn being attachable. Life functions as a shield for hand size. The game's turn flow of drawing a card, getting more Dawn, and swinging with leader form a basic tempo that each card played affects. Some cards have much bigger impacts on this economy than others. In One Piece, the basic level of economy is a vanilla monster. Our example here is a 5 cost with 7 attack. Each turn it swings, it can either take a life or move 2 cards from an opponent's hand. A middle level economy can be something like with Carrot. It takes 1 card from an opponent's hand, but takes away an opponent's economy, and pseudo gives you cards in your hand. Then on the highest impact level, you have something like Tashigi, which in combination with Zoro Leader does both the previous positive economy for you, the negative economy on the opponent, and immediate pressure on life. I'd define a high-impact card as being any card which can net a value swing of 5 or more cards from the impact of it being played. It's a very flexible definition and tends to change a lot depending on when in the game it's played, but you'll find One Piece as a game is warped around these big powerful pieces that disproportionately affect card economy. Furthermore, we can use this definition of a high-impact card to determine the power level of the game in meta. Early on in the game's run, a net swing of 2 would be game-ending. From OP5 to OP12, a swing of 4 would be good. Post OP13, anything swinging for 5 or more is what defines meta decks. Really, having some high-value cards that can go on par with the meta card economy is the first prerequisite of a meta deck, either inherently or situationally. Where a deck plays its high card economy cards is how we determine its playstyle. Emu and Ace both have their highest impact cards being 10 cost, so they're more late game control decks. Green Zoro has its high impact 5 cost, so it's more mid game tempo deck. And Rayleigh has all of its high impact cards on cheap chump units, so it's aggro. Decks either win or lose entirely by how they are able to find, play, and defend these cards. This is also how the game determines its tempo. A Rayleigh versus Emu matchup is the question of if that Rayleigh player can use enough high-impact cards to skew the card economy to such an extreme that Emu's late-game high-impact cards don't matter. The skill of One Piece comes from cards which can be high-impact cards in the right situation. In Bonnie, for example, Cavendish is a high-impact card, but only if it's able to remain on board. It reduces each successive turn's resource cost and enables other high-impact plays. A large portion of the deck is dedicated to limiting an opponent's options or setting up protection effects so Cavendish can stick. An opponent has to use some method to quickly clear it to stop its value generation, and navigate around the Bonnie player's defenses. In terms of card economy, One Piece has had a mixed track record. Typically, Bandai will release a Power Creep set and starter deck around every anniversary, which increases the limit on high-impact cards, and then will slowly work to catch up the rest of the game. It is a model designed to increase sales and not inherently to balance games. As such, it creates a very distinct cycle with a power-defining first set that then narrows down into a refined triangle or single deck format, usually around an engine or color. Meanwhile, decks slowly catch up with trickle-down support that will only get massive usage once a ban list sticks and a jungle format appears. Typically, when a new power levels appear, they come packaged with some new mechanics. Block 2 was removal, Block 3 was survivability and defensive creep, and if I had to guess, Block 4 is probably consistency. Let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a rogue and meta deck in One Piece? Is it the strength of their interactions, the speed of their gameplay, or the consistency of the strategy? If you've played any rogue deck, you know very quickly it's not the strength of their interactions. A majority of decks in the game have combos and options that can immediately push card economy in their favor, even ahead of meta decks. The speed of the gameplay doesn't fit either, since we quite frequently have absurdly slow decks taking top slots. So, it has to be consistency. And yeah, every deck that's been meta seems to have more consistent options than its contemporaries. Set 1 Captain Kidd had the win condition on its leader, Whitebeard got to see more cards per game with 6 life, Sakazuki had a once per turn draw and discard, Law had 8 to 12 cards that solve each specific problem the deck had, Lucci had a mill each turn, Dofi had insane stacking, etc. If 2 decks are on the same power level, the deck that can access that power level more consistently will win. It's the ability to find your high impact cards or the options that enable them that makes a meta deck. And this access to consistency is the most unbalanced area of the One Piece card game. There is such a large difference of options between the top decks and the rogue. Consistency in One Piece comes down to 3 questions. Does your leader enable consistency? Do you have multiple searchers or flexible searchers? And how many 2 to 3 card combos does your deck have? 8 to 12 searchers is often what the meta decks come to. For example, Zoro and Bonnie can run 2 to 3 different high power searchers, while Carrot, Kuro, and Fishman each only get 1 true searcher. So their few good combos are very difficult to use across a long tournament. Consistency-focused leaders are also a big contributor, Imu and Sakazuki being the 2 biggest examples of this. An extra draw and setup each turn enables perfect control of the late game. That early tempo check of an aggro deck to see if it can make it to late game is solved when a control deck has better access to its full value. 2 to 3 card combos is more of a secondary check than the first 2. A deck can be meta if it's dependent on 2 to 3 card combos, but for a deck with a lack of the first 2 factors, this is a death sentence. Think leaders like Usopp, King, or Carrot, which are all dependent on stage and pieces for value. Or heaven forbid you're playing something like Kazuki Oden, where you have to see the 4 pieces of Exodia to play the game. Now, consistency is what deck building in One Piece is about. Building decks around higher value combos is cool, but the real winning options come from consistency. So, if you'll remember from the format graphic I showed earlier, there's a big chunk of metas that I called refining formats. These come about when the best options and playstyles of a block are discovered and optimized. Players aren't stupid and will gravitate towards the most powerful decks. Players identified high-value cards like Radical Beam, Gecko Moria, and Gum Gum Giant, which could consistently outvalue an opponent. They then took these cards and optimized strategies around them. Or, more accurately, discovered that the best strategies were those that could abuse these high-value cards consistently. Refining formats typically have at least 50% of the top spots taken by decks running the same engine, with the second largest portion of decks being counters to that engine. It's a format of One Piece where matchups are standard, and typically the player who can best optimize them will perform well. A more recent development is what decks have access to these high-value cards. Historically, the only limit on what can run what was color. Gecko Moria was only locked to black decks, and the red package to red. This would create problems where these staples would warp any future support around them and limit game design. It's explicitly the reason behind most Block 2 ban lists. More to the point, games were unbalanced by color choice more than what was healthy or fun. A big thing about these earlier blocks was how Bandai would print strong support for colors in waves. It was never evenly spread out and always in compact back-to-back sets. For example, sets 5 and 6 was a 1-2 punch of Rebecca and Rob Lucci, followed by Gecko and Moria, and the two leaders that made those work. Rebecca and Rob Lucci still warped deck building in black decks, and Gecko and Moria had to be banned entirely. There is a timeline where the meta of the game could better develop, or more healthily develop, if they spread these cards around the entire block instead of just 2 sets. It could have allowed for a more balanced format where the secondary decks would have actually stood a chance. But instead, the game homogenized quickly around the black engine. Bandai also didn't really think about future-proofing these options in other decks, which will really show when how future black decks become entirely optimized around these cards instead of working with the support they were inherently printed with. Really, Bandai's game design is absurdly limited to only think about what leaders are in the current set. And in good faith, even if it's not, it really does come across that way when you're a player in this game. Which is how I think we can explain why recently, Bandai has been much more heavy on leader-restricted effects. Newer leaders all have their high-value cards leader-locked. Ace is pseudo-locked, Tashigi is Zoro-locked, the 5 Elders is Emu-locked, and the Straw Hat package from Block 3 is locked in the Straw Hats, but there are a lot of Luffys in One Piece, go figure. It's created a new style of meta where leaders are more homogenized. Instead of limiting to a color, it limits deck building to a theme. You still need to hit the same power level and consistency requirements, but now so much less can hit it. How many older decks have access to a 5 Elders or Tashigi level card and have the consistency to play it? So, Bandai, in their attempt to better balance and future-proof the game, has effectively rotated out a majority of older leaders before the actual rotation. And things are more unbalanced than ever between meta and rogue. If you ask me, the solution to this balancing issue is just to print less obviously problematic cards. Leader locked or not, there's still problems which eventually have to be dealt with. It's clear the number one priority of Bandai is to sell sets at the expense of everything else, which makes sense, especially from a short-term financial perspective. But if One Piece is to maintain its relevance as a fourth competitor to the big three long-term, the power creeping and horrible balance must be limited. Players like to use their old cards, and have some variance in their games. Power creeping and designing obviously unbalanced cards is speedrunning the inability to find enjoyment in the card game for the wider, more casual pool of players, especially for a game as casual as One Piece is. The lack of future-proofing goes a bit further than that. Something Bandai really likes to do is design decks entirely around toxic playstyles or mechanics. By toxic, I mean broad mechanical shutoffs, as opposed to something like just having a lot of removal. These playstyles are fundamentally baked into the game through the leader system, and are often decided before a player sits down at the table. Players find these playstyles fun because they often distort the game into playing around a unique win condition or into an interesting value loop. One that's fun to deck build and optimize around, or one that provides an undue advantage in some competitive formats. NL likes to go to 1 life and constantly take small amounts of damage and to heal, as a means to cycle cards, play triggers, and build board. But for an opponent whose deck is based on dealing small amounts of damage, this means having your main win condition turned off while you sit at the table. It's made worse by NL having luck mechanics, which can artificially extend a game and remove what should have been a sure win. It's this warping of the flow of the game state that has always made One Piece very interesting, but also endlessly upsetting. Players don't like sitting down to games where they can't play their cards, obviously. Bandai tends to lean into these more toxic playstyles as a means of experimenting with new effects, but really they don't think these through. Nami is a classic self-deck out alt-win condition. This means that any draw or mill effects in the color blue are support for it. So every blue effect design had to have draw power removed or restricted until Nami was eventually banned 8-ish sets later, when something inevitably wanted to use that design space and created problems. People hated playing against Nami, and people did not enjoy how underbaked blue decks felt as a lead strategy, especially since how nerfed draw power was while it was the central gimmick of the color. In a different example, any healing effects or life manipulation is NL support before it's anything else. It's led Bandai to having to limit how yellow cards can be designed. I mean, we've already had one card banned because of NL, despite how much it opened up really interesting gameplay patterns in other decks. It doesn't think through how leaders will impact game in the future, nor how single cards will. Even when the game is balanced, it's often on a technicality, and I think it's the biggest tragedy of this game's design. The rotation system seems to be something they're implementing as a solution to this, but due to how quickly the power creeping is on a block-by-block basis, I'm not sure this will be a solution. I want to end this video with a positive note of how One Piece's Unbalancing has been used to create genuine fun. In OP13, a new wave of green support released around the central gimmick of restanding Dawn on play, then getting a second effect. While not focused on as much due to the best two decks not being green, every green rogue deck has been able to utilize different parts of this support wave in dynamic ways because of the leader system. Thanks to its ramp, Lim has been able to abuse the high-cost Sanji and Shanks as bodies faster. But Shanks also sets them up to use the powerful purple counter events. Zoro gets a new Zoro, which is a body for going wide quickly. This one's boring, but it is what it is. Bonnie gets the new 6-drop Law, which lets them replay its value 5-drops and grind better in the late game. Carrot gets the new Uda, which lets it play its chump units, and defensively play its stun Carrot. Green Uda, Chopper, Red-Green Luffy, OP2 Law, and legitimately any of the game's 28 green leaders get unique interactions with these cards in ways that are so interesting to build around. It takes each of these unique leader effects and dynamically highlights their strengths and weaknesses. The natural unbalances of the leader system creates a unique context for every card to exist in. Even decks that run the same card run it differently. Red-Green Smoker gets a defensive buff to its units, so the rested unit played off the 6th Law is defensible through counter. Bonnie can limit what an opponent can swing at the body and play for value regardless of an opponent's interactions. Chopper and Law go wide enough to not have to care about the rested body, and Carrot can just withstand the unit and not play those games. The deck differences make the game more fun, and allow a player to perfectly fit a deck to their playstyle. While the OP13 meta is mostly built around 2 decks at an absurd power level, every green deck is having the most fun ever in the game's lifetime as a rogue deck. And working to find unique solutions to the crazy state of the game is what makes One Piece fun, and it highlights why the game works. The imbalances create opportunities for skill expression and innovation. That's why I love the card game. Bandai's design team falls into a ton of game design pitfalls, and unfortunately, most card games do that repeatedly. How good a card game is more of a question of what good comes from the system because of those flaws. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.